Let's see the step 2 in the urine formation. Step 1 was the formation of the glomerular filtrate. We already went over that in another video. Now we are going to talk about the step 2, which is the reabsorption or absorption from the tubules. As soon as the filtrate moves into the proximal convoluted tubule from the capsular space, the process of reabsorption starts. Reabsorption is a selective transepithelial process. Almost all the organic nutrients, they are reabsorbed, and the water and the ion reabsorption, they are hormonally regulated and adjusted. So the process of reabsorption, it includes both active and passive tubular reabsorption. There are two routes or two pathways in which the reabsorption can occur. One is known as transcellular, other is the paracellular. So now we can visualize over here is the filtrate. That filtrate has moved into the tubule. As soon as it moves into the tubule, the process of reabsorption, it starts. So this is a capillary. And if it is a juxtaglomerular nephron, then this is a vasa recta. There are two routes which the reabsorption can take. The first route is known as the transcellular route. So what is the transcellular route? In this, the solute, it enters the apical membrane of the tubule cell, then it travels through the cytosol of the tubule cells, and then it exits at the basolateral membrane of the tubule cell. For example, if this is cell and this is the solute, and so it goes in the cell and then it goes to the through the basolateral side, it goes in the interstitial fluid. Over here will be our capillary. If I draw over here, this will be our capillary and this is our lumen. So this is the transcellular route. The solute is going through the cell. Then our second route is the paracellular route. What is paracellular? Now consider there is another cell. Usually between the tubular cells, there are tight junctions. So solute cannot pass through there. But in some portions of the tubules, especially in the proximal convoluted tubules, these tight junctions are leaky. So the solute, they can pass from the middle of the cells. So this is paracellular route and they're going to the capillaries. And water, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and some sodium in the proximal convoluted tubule, they move via this route. Now let's see in detail how the substances, they are absorbed. What are the processes? So let's go over this slowly over all the steps. Let's look at the transcellular route. Our water and solute, they come in the cell from the apical surface. This is the lumen. This is the lumen in which the filtrate is. This is the tubular cell. This is the apical surface. This is the basal surface. This is the interstitial fluid, and this is the capillary. So our water and solute, they have come in from the apical side. Now they diffuse through the cytosol and they go into the interstitial fluid. Now they are transported across the basolateral membrane into the interstitial fluid, and this can also go through here through the lateral intercellular space. They can go to the interstitial fluid through this as well, or they can go straight through this. Now they move through the interstitial fluid and into the capillary. Now let's see at the paracellular route. The paracellular route, it involves the movement through the leaky tight junctions. So here water and solutes, they are moving through the leaky tight junctions. They are not going in the cytosol. And this particularly happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. And then they go into the interstitial fluid, and then they move into the capillary. Now let's see how different ions and solutes in water, they are transported, they are reabsorbed from the lumen into the capillaries. First of all, we will talk about sodium. Sodium is our most abundant and most important cation in the filtrate. Sodium is actively transported out of the tubular cell by sodium-potassium ATPase pump in the basolateral membrane. So the sodium which is present in the cell, it is taken out of the cell by this sodium-potassium ATPase. So if this is a cell and this is the apical membrane and this is the basal membrane, this is where the sodium potassium ATPase pump is present, and it is using energy to move the sodium out of the cell, and in exchange it brings potassium in I'm sorry about that, in exchange it brings potassium inside the cell. So sodium is moving outside and potassium is moving inside. And what happens to this potassium? That as soon as it moves inside the cell, it diffuses out of the cell. So now we have sodium deficiency inside the cell. Also we have cation deficiency inside the cell. And this sodium is then, when sodium goes out, it is swept by water and other solutes into the peritubular capillaries. So this is the peritubular capillaries. Just like I said before, water loves sodium, so water is going to follow the sodium and it is going to sweep the sodium into the peritubular capillaries. So this is our sodium, and it is the first step, it is the transportation of the sodium out of the cell by sodium potassium ATPase. So our sodium has moved out. Let me make the cell again. Our sodium has moved out because of the sodium potassium ATPase pump, which is present on the basolateral surface. This is the basolateral surface, and after interstitial fluid, here is the capillary, and this is our lumen. And in our lumen, this orangish thing in the lumen, yellow, this is our filtrate. So this is the lumen. Now the sodium has moved out, and because of the outward movement of the sodium, there is a pressure gradient. There is deficient sodium inside the cell. And also I said that the potassium which comes in, it leaks out. The potassium is coming in, but it leaks out into the interstitial fluid. Now we have a cation deficit inside the cell, and also we have a sodium deficit inside the cell. And so this active pumping of sodium at the basolateral membrane, it results in strong electrochemical gradient within the tubular cell, and it results in this low intracellular sodium. It facilitates diffusion of sodium from the apical surface into the cell. So sodium, it moves inside the cell, and because we also have less cations in the cell because this potassium is diffusing back. It is in the interstitial fluid. So because low sodium and low cations in the cell, sodium moves in the cell. So this sodium reabsorption by the primary active transport, which is happening at the basolateral surface of the cell, it provides the energy for the inward movement of the sodium. It also provides the energy and means for reabsorbing almost every other substance. So what this is known as secondary active transport. What is secondary active transport? That the electrochemical gradient created by the pumps at the basolateral surface, it gives a push needed for the transport of other solutes and organic nutrients. They are reabsorbed by secondary active transport. Why are we calling it secondary? Because the energy is coming from the ATPase. And these are co-transported along with sodium. So if I make my cell here again, this is the basolateral surface and this is the apical surface. And this is where the pump is working, and because of that pump we have a gradient, and there are some transport proteins which are co-transporters. So they bring in sodium, but along with that they also bring in other electrolytes and also other organic substances like glucose, amino acid. They also come inside the cell along with this co-transportation. Water, it moves because of the osmotic gradient which is created by the sodium and other solutes. Because of that, the water moves from the lumen into the capillaries. And there is a term known as obligatory water reabsorption. What is that? There are transmembrane proteins which are called aquaporins, and they are present abundantly in the tubules. Especially they are present in the proximal convoluted tubules. These aquaporins, they cause reabsorption of the water, and water can pass through these aquaporins. So the water moves back regardless of the state of hydration of the body. This is known as obligatory water reabsorption. Then there is another term which is known as facultative water reabsorption. So these aquaporins, they are absent in the collecting ducts. In the collecting ducts, when the hormone ADH is present, it causes the appearance of these aquaporins, and then water can be reabsorbed from the collecting ducts. So this is known as facultative water reabsorption, which is under the influence of antidiuretic hormone. Now let's see how other nutrients and ions, they are reabsorbed. So water is reabsorbed, and the concentration, it increases for the rest of the solutes in the filtrate which is present in the tubules. So if possible for these solutes, it means if the cell is permeable to these solutes, they are going to follow the water. This is how many lipid soluble substances and certain ions and also urea, they are reabsorbed. Reabsorption of sodium also causes passive reabsorption of ions like chloride. Let's go over this diagram. Let's go step by step. Sodium, it is actively transported by a pump which is present on the basolateral surface of the tubular cells. This pump is pumping 3 sodium out of the cell, and it is bringing 2 potassium in. This potassium which comes inside the cell, it leaks back into the interstitial fluid. This is using active energy because it is transporting sodium against its concentration gradient, so ATP is being used. This is known as sodium potassium ATPase. And now let's see what happens next. Because of this sodium potassium ATPase, there is downhill entry of sodium from the apical surface. Now we have created a sodium deficit and a cation deficit inside the cell. Now the sodium, it diffuses passively from the apical surface, and also it uses a transport protein. This transport protein, it is a co-transporter. So what does that mean? It means that along with the sodium, some organic nutrients, they also come inside the cell. So these organic nutrients, glucose, amino acid, some ions and vitamins, they are using the gradient, the electrical gradient created by the sodium potassium ATPase pump. Along with the sodium, they are also transported inside the cell using this co-transport protein. Reabsorption of water occurs through the aquaporins. Aquaporins are transport proteins which are present in the cells, and water moves in. Now when water moves in, this place, it becomes concentrated. The solutes which are left here, they are concentrated, so they try to follow their concentration gradient. They move from the higher concentration to the lower concentration. Many of the lipid soluble substances, this is how they move inside the cell. We know lipids, they do not have any problem crossing the plasma membrane. So this is how they take the transcellular route and they come in. Then many other ions, for example, chloride, calcium, potassium, urea, they also diffuse by the paracellular route. They can come through here between the tight junctions, especially in the proximal convoluted tubule. Now there is a term which is known as transport maximum. What is transport maximum? So transport maximum, it happens for almost all of the transport systems. What are the transport systems? They are the proteins or anything or channels which the ions there or the substances they're using to be transported. And it represents the number of transport proteins present in the tubules. When these transporters are saturated, the excess is excreted in the urine. Let me read it from here. So transcellular transport systems are specific and limited. Why? Specific because there can be a specific transport protein for a specific nutrient, and then they are limited because when all of the transport systems they are saturated, they are being used, then the further amount of that ion or that nutrient, it cannot be reabsorbed. So, transport maximum exists for almost every reabsorbed substance. It reflects the number of carriers in the renal tubules that are available. When these carriers are saturated, thus excess solute is excreted in the urine. This is what happens in diabetes mellitus when there is uncontrolled blood sugar. There is too much glucose, and the glucose transporters, they reach the transport maximum. Now the excess glucose, it spills in the urine. So we have discussed the general reabsorption process. Now let's see what happens in each part of the tubule. Let's start with the proximal convoluted tubule. So in proximal convoluted tubules, almost all nutrients such as glucose, amino acids, they are reabsorbed. 65% of the sodium and water are reabsorbed. Many ions are reabsorbed, almost all uric acid, and about half of the urea, it is reabsorbed. This urea, it will be later on secreted into the filtrate. From the proximal convoluted tubules, the fluid, it moves into the Henle loop. So the loop of Henle, it is the place where the urine is going to get concentrated. We know it has a descending limb and an ascending limb. The descending limb is permeable to water, but it is impermeable to solute. So in this part of the tubule, the water is not following the solute. In the descending limb, it is permeable to water. The water can be reabsorbed. They are aquaporin channels, but the solutes cannot move. They stay in the lumen. And then in the ascending limb, it becomes opposite. Now the water cannot leave. It is impermeable to water because there are not enough aquaporin channels in the ascending limb. But the solutes, it is permeable to the solutes. We know it has a thin segment and a thick segment. Now let's see what happens to the sodium, because sodium is a very important cation. So in the thin segment of the loop of Henle, in the thin ascending limb, the movement of the sodium is passive. And then in the thick ascending limb on the basolateral side, there is a sodium potassium ATPase, which is causing a deficiency of sodium inside the cell. And on the apical surface, we have sodium potassium 2 chloride symporter. Symporter, right, is that it is transporting everything in the same direction. So these ions, they come from the lumen into the cell. And then on the apical surface, we also have sodium hydrogen antiporter. It means that it is bringing the sodium in, but it is taking the hydrogen out. They are moving in opposite direction. And some sodium in this channel, it can also travel by paracellular route. About 50% of the sodium, it passes from the paracellular route in this part, in the loop of Henle. From the thick ascending limb, now our filtrate has reached the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So this is the area of the tubule which is controlled or regulated by the hormones. Now there are certain hormones which are going to act on this part. We know antidiuretic hormone. Anti means against, diuretic means urine. So this is the hormone which is going to reabsorb the water and reduce the amount of the urine produced. We know antidiuretic hormone, it is released by the posterior pituitary gland, and it has its receptors on the principal cells of the collecting duct. And when it attaches to its receptor, it brings upon a series of events, and the end result is that there are more aquaporins on the apical membranes, and those aquaporins, they increase the water reabsorption. And when the ADH is absent, those aquaporins, they are not present in this part of the tube. Then our second hormone, which acts in the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule, it is aldosterone. So the target cells are present in the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubules. These target cells are the principal cells of the collecting duct. And what do they do? What is the end result of this attaching of the hormone with its receptor on the target cell? It promotes synthesis of apical sodium and potassium channels and basolateral sodium potassium ATPase for sodium reabsorption. And when sodium is reabsorbed, the water, it follows. And as a result, very little sodium, it leaves the body, and also very little water, it leaves the body. And without aldosterone, we will lose about 2% of sodium every day, which is incompatible with life. This is why when we read aldosterone, we said that this is essential for life. If someone has no aldosterone, they won't be able to live. And then there is another function of aldosterone, that is that it causes excretion of the potassium. So when the potassium is high, the aldosterone secretion, it is stimulated, and body gets rid of the potassium. Then we have another hormone which is known as atrial natriuretic peptide. We know that it is secreted by the atria when the blood pressure is too high, and it acts opposite to the aldosterone. It causes excretion of the sodium and the water follows. In this way, it decreases the blood volume and the blood pressure. And then parathyroid hormone, it also has receptors in the distal convoluted tubule. When parathyroid hormone, it attaches to its receptor, it causes increased reabsorption of the calcium from the tubules. Now this figure, it gives the summary of all the things we discussed. You can go over this, so let's go over this quickly. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. Maximum reabsorption is going to occur here. From here it goes to the loop of the Henle. In the descending limb, the water, it is permeable to water, but the ascending limb, it is impermeable to water, but it is permeable to the solutes. In the thin segment, the reabsorption of the sodium is passive, but in the thick segment we have sodium potassium chloride symporter, and then we also have sodium hydrogen antiporter, and then we also have sodium potassium ATPase. And then from here we go to the distal convoluted tubule. It is over here, and distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, that the hormones, they act. You can go over this figure, and it will be a good revision for everything we talked about. And this is a chart. It also summarizes all we have been talking about.